Part 1. The Hook. I caught my husband's affair through our daughter's baby monitor. Not because he was careless, because he genuinely forgot that the monitor in her nursery doubled as a speaker system connected to an app on my phone. An app I checked almost every night out of habit just to hear her breathing while I worked late in the kitchen. One night, instead of the soft static and occasional coo I was used to, I heard my husband's voice coming through that little speaker, low and warm, saying words to someone that were most certainly not meant for me. He'd walked into the nursery to take a call he thought was private, forgetting, or maybe just not caring enough to remember, that the monitor was still live. I sat at our kitchen table with my daughter's baby monitor in my hand, listening to my husband tell another woman that he loved her, and I didn't move for almost 10 minutes. I just sat there, absorbing it, feeling something enormous and cold settle into my chest that has never fully left since. That was the night I found out my marriage, the one I thought was young and imperfect, but fundamentally solid, was actually built on top of a secret that had been growing for months, right under my roof, sometimes literally in the next room while I nursed our daughter to sleep. Let me tell you how we got there. Part 2, how we started. I'll call myself Megan for this story, and I'll call my husband Ryan. We met in our mid-20s at a mutual friend's engagement party, the kind of meeting that felt almost too easy. We ended up talking on the porch for 2 hours while everyone else danced inside, and by the end of the night he'd asked for my number in a way that felt refreshingly direct after years of non-committal dating app matches. We moved in together after about a year, got engaged after 2, and married at 3 in a small ceremony at a lake house his family owned upstate. I remember our wedding day as one of the purest, happiest days of my life. Not because it was extravagant, it wasn't, but because I remember looking at Ryan during our vows and feeling this deep, settled certainty that I'd found someone genuinely good, not perfect, but good, someone who showed up, someone who, when my father was in the hospital for a minor surgery early in our relationship, drove 4 hours round trip just to sit in the waiting room with me for 2 hours before driving back for work the next morning. Our daughter, Sophie, was born about 2 years into the marriage. Ryan was, by every visible measure, an involved father. He did the 2 a.m. bottle rotations with me. He researched pediatricians obsessively. He cried, actually cried, the first time Sophie grabbed his finger in the hospital. I want to be clear about this because it matters for what comes later. This wasn't a marriage that looked broken from the outside, or even from the inside, until it very suddenly and completely was. By the time Sophie was about 8 months old, we'd settled into that particular exhausted rhythm every new parent knows. Sleep deprived, stretched thin, but generally functional, generally still a team. I went back to work part-time. Ryan's job in commercial real estate had him traveling more than before Sophie was born, but that had always been part of his role, so I didn't think much of it. That's the marriage I believed I was living in, right up until the night that baby monitor betrayed a secret I never asked it to reveal. Part 3. The first cracks. Looking back now, I can identify a slow shift that started roughly around Sophie's 6-month mark, though at the time it didn't register as anything more than the ordinary strain of new parenthood. Ryan's business trips started running longer. What used to be a single overnight became 2 nights, then occasionally 3. He explained it as needing more time to close deals in a slower market, needing to build relationships with clients that required extended in-person time. I had no reason to question this. I didn't know his industry well enough to have a baseline for what was normal, and grief brain new parent exhaustion doesn't leave a lot of energy for interrogation. I noticed gradually that he started taking work calls in the car instead of in the house, even for calls that seemed like they could easily happen at the kitchen table. He started stepping out onto our back porch for phone conversations that used to just happen in front of me. When I asked who he was talking to, the answer was almost always some version of just a client, delivered in a tone that, in hindsight, had just the faintest edge of impatience whenever I asked. There was a specific night around Sophie's 7-month mark that I still think about. Ryan came home late from what he said was a client dinner, and when he leaned down to kiss me hello, I caught a trace of perfume that wasn't mine, floral and unfamiliar. I remember the thought crossing my mind, clean, clear, unmistakable. And then I remember actively pushing it away, telling myself it could have transferred from a hug with a colleague, from sitting near someone at a restaurant, from 1,000 innocent possibilities. New motherhood does something to your capacity for self-protective denial. You are so tired, so stretched, that confronting a suspicion feels like a luxury you can't afford, so you file it away and keep moving. The late nights kept increasing. The phone calls kept moving further from my presence. Car, porch, sometimes even outside in the driveway at 10 at night, pacing back and forth while I watched from the window, telling myself it was work stress, telling myself new parenthood was hard on everyone, telling myself I was the one being paranoid and unfair for even noticing. I want to pause here and say something, because I think it's important for anyone listening who's been in this position. Noticing small things and talking yourself out of them isn't weakness. It's actually one of the most human responses there is. You are protecting the life you've built, the family you're in the middle of raising, the version of your husband you fell in love with. Doubting all of that isn't easy, and it isn't something you do lightly, even when some part of you already senses the truth waiting underneath. Part 4. The suspicion grows. By the time Sophie turned 9 months old, the small, strange things had accumulated into a pattern I could no longer explain away, even with all my careful self-talk. Ryan started guarding his phone in a way he never had before, face down constantly, a new passcode he changed from our anniversary date to something I didn't know, notifications silenced so thoroughly that I never once saw a text preview flash across his screen anymore, not even by accident. He started showering the moment he got home from work. Every single day, something that had never been part of his routine before. I remember bringing it up once, carefully, over dinner. "You've been in a really good mood lately, actually," I said, trying to sound light, testing the water. "Work going well?" And he said yes, work was going great. He'd landed a couple of big clients. Things were finally clicking after a rough year. He smiled when he said it, genuinely, easily, and something about that smile unsettled me more than if he'd looked guilty. It was the smile of a man who was happy, truly happy, in a way that had nothing to do with our home. I started calling my best friend, Carly, more during the stretch, the way you reach for someone you trust when you don't yet have language for what's bothering you. I told her, almost apologetically, that something felt off with Ryan, that I couldn't name it, that maybe I was just touched out and exhausted and projecting my own insecurity onto an innocent situation. Carly, to her credit, didn't dismiss me. She asked good questions. How often was he traveling? Had his habits changed? Was there anything specific I could point to? I didn't have anything concrete yet. Just a feeling, thick and persistent, that something in our house had shifted. The moment that finally cracked the dam of my denial happened almost by accident, about 6 weeks before the baby monitor incident. I was doing laundry and found a hotel keycard in the pocket of Ryan's jeans, not a receipt, just the plastic keycard itself from a hotel across town, dated the previous week during a stretch when he'd told me he was staying with his brother for a work thing 2 states away. I stood in our laundry room holding that little piece of plastic, and for the first time, I let myself fully feel the suspicion I'd been suppressing for months. Not push it away, not explain it, just feel it in its full weight, sitting heavy in my chest. Part 5. Digging deeper, that hotel keycard changed something in me. I stopped trying to talk myself out of my own instincts and started quietly, methodically, paying real attention. I began keeping a private log, the way you might build a case file without fully admitting to yourself that's what you're doing. I noted the dates of his work trips and cross-referenced them where I could against what I actually knew about his schedule from mutual friends in the industry. I noticed that one trip he'd claimed was to a conference in another state didn't line up. A friend of his, someone I ran into at the grocery store, mentioned offhand that he thought that particular conference had actually been canceled that year due to low registration. I checked our joint credit card statement, something I hadn't paid close attention to in months, buried as I was in new parent logistics. I found 2 charges at a boutique hotel downtown, not the one from the keycard, a different one. Both charged on days he'd told me he was working late at the office. I found a charge from a jewelry store, small, $45, on a day I never received any gift. I started noticing his mood swings more clearly too now that I was actually watching for them instead of absorbing them passively. He was electric, almost giddy on certain mornings. The mornings I now understood that correlated with whatever secret life was unfolding without me. And he was irritable, short-tempered, distant on the days immediately after, in a way I now recognize as guilt curdling into defensiveness. About 2 weeks before the baby monitor night, I reached out to Carly again, this time with actual details instead of just a feeling. I told her about the key card, the mismatched trip, the hotel charges. She was quiet for a moment, and then she told me something that made my stomach drop even further. She'd seen Ryan a few weeks earlier at a restaurant near her office, having lunch with a woman she didn't recognize. And something about how close they were sitting, how engaged in conversation they seemed, had struck her as odd at the time, though she told herself it was probably a work colleague and hadn't thought to mention it. I asked her to describe the woman. Blonde, athletic, maybe early 30s, professionally dressed. It matched nothing specific I could confirm yet, but it added another data point to a picture that was becoming impossible to ignore. I didn't confront Ryan yet. Some steady, careful part of me knew I needed more than fragments and instincts before I turned our entire life upside down. I needed something undeniable. And 2 weeks later, sitting in my kitchen with Sophie's baby monitor in my hand, I got exactly that. Part 6. The night of the monitor. It was a Tuesday. Ryan had told me he needed to run out for about an hour to grab something from the office he'd forgotten, a detail that felt unremarkable at the time. I was in the kitchen, laptop open, trying to catch up on emails during Sophie's evening nap, the baby monitor app open on my phone beside me, the way it always was. I heard the front door open around 8:40, quieter than usual, and I assumed Ryan was back from the office. A few minutes later, through the monitor, I heard him. Not in our bedroom, not in the living room, but in Sophie's nursery. His voice low, warm, unmistakably tender in a way that had nothing to do with checking on a sleeping baby. I know, I miss you too," he said. A pause. I can't stop thinking about last night either. Another pause, longer this time, and then quiet enough that I almost missed it, almost convinced myself I'd misheard. "I love you. I'll figure out a way to see you this weekend, I promise." I sat completely still at that kitchen table, the phone in my hand, listening to my husband tell another woman he loved her, standing in our daughter's nursery, 10 feet from her crib, while I sat in the next room believing he'd just run out for a work errand. I don't fully remember the next several minutes. I remember standing up at some point, walking quietly to the hallway outside the nursery door, and standing there listening to the last 30 seconds of that call in person instead of through the monitor. The soft, easy affection in his voice, the kind I hadn't heard directed at me in longer than I wanted to admit. I didn't open the door. I went back to the kitchen, sat back down, and waited for him to come out. When he did, a few minutes later, he looked relaxed, almost happy, and he said, "Hey, sorry that took a while. Work stuff," and leaned down to kiss my forehead the way he always did. I let him. I didn't say a single word about what I'd just heard. Some cold, clear part of me had already made a decision. I wasn't going to confront him in that moment on his terms, with no evidence beyond my own memory of an overheard call he could easily deny or reframe. I was going to find out everything first. Part 7. Building the full picture. The 2 weeks that followed the monitor incident were, without exaggeration, the strangest and loneliest of my entire life. I moved through our daily routine, feeding Sophie, going to work, making dinner, sleeping next to Ryan every night, while carrying a secret so large it felt physically heavy, all while he had no idea I now knew. I started carefully and deliberately gathering everything I could. I went back through our credit card statements with fresh eyes, now able to recognize the pattern I'd been too afraid to see clearly before. I found a consistent rhythm. Charges roughly every 10 to 12 days, always at the same handful of restaurants and one specific hotel, always on days he'd claimed to be working late or meeting clients. I reached out to Carly again and asked her gently if she'd be willing to help me figure out who the woman from the restaurant was. She agreed immediately, without hesitation, and a few days later, she managed to get a photo, not intrusively, just a normal photo from a work event she happened to also be attending, where the same woman she'd seen with Ryan turned out to be present, working the event in some professional capacity. Carly sent me the photo along with a name, Danielle, apparently a marketing consultant who worked with several firms in the same building as Ryan's office, including, I would later confirm, his own. I looked Danielle up. Early 30s, recently divorced according to her public social media, professionally successful, the kind of polished, confident presence that made my chest ache, with a complicated mixture of anger and a strange, painful insecurity I hated myself for feeling. I hired a private investigator during that second week, a decision that felt almost absurd, typing into a search bar late at night while Ryan slept beside me, but one that felt necessary if I wanted proof solid enough that he couldn't talk his way around it. I gave the investigator Ryan's upcoming schedule, another work trip planned for that coming weekend, the same weekend I'd overheard him promise through the baby monitor that he'd figure out a way to see Danielle. 4 days later, I had photographs. Ryan and Danielle checking into a hotel together Friday evening. The two of them at dinner, her hand resting on his arm in a way that told its own complete story. The two of them leaving the hotel together the following morning, Ryan carrying both their bags out to his car with the same easy familiarity he used to carry mine years earlier before any of this began. I had everything I needed now. The photographs, the financial trail. The overheard phone call still burned into my memory, and underneath all of it, a decision I'd been quietly building toward for 2 full weeks, waiting for the right moment to finally bring everything into the light. Part 8. Who else knew? Before I confronted Ryan, I made one more discovery that changed the shape of this story in a way I hadn't expected. I mentioned to Carly during one of our late night phone calls that week that I was trying to piece together how long this had actually been going on, and she said something that stopped me cold. She mentioned that Ryan's coworker, a guy named Pete, who I'd met a handful of times at company holiday parties, had made an offhand comment to his own wife a few months earlier about Ryan having a lot going on, in a tone that Carly said had struck his wife as odd enough that she'd mentioned it to Carly at the time, though none of them had connected the dots until now. I reached out to Pete's wife directly, as gently as I could, and what she told me confirmed something I'd feared. Ryan had apparently told Pete about the affair months earlier, framing it at the time as something he was trying to end, a phrase I now understand that guilty people use to make themselves feel like they're already halfway toward doing the right thing, even while they continue doing the opposite. Pete hadn't told anyone, not out of malice from what I understand, but out of the same misguided loyalty I've heard about in so many stories like this one. A belief that it wasn't his place, that Ryan would figure it out himself, that staying quiet was somehow the neutral, hands-off choice. I don't know Pete well enough to fully judge his internal reasoning, but I know what his silence cost me. Months of additional lies I might have been spared, months of my own instincts being quietly, systematically undermined by a husband who knew the entire time that at least one other person was aware of exactly what he was doing to me. That detail, more than almost anything else, hardened something in me. This wasn't a brief lapse, a single mistake made in a weak moment. This was a sustained, months-long double life, one that other people around him had brushed up against and chosen, each in their own way, to let continue. I finished building my case that week with a clarity I hadn't expected to feel. Not rage exactly, something colder and steadier than that. I was ready. Part 9. The confrontation. I chose a Saturday morning, while Sophie napped, to sit Ryan down at our kitchen table. The same table where I'd first heard his voice through that baby monitor 2.5 weeks earlier. I laid everything out in front of him without preamble. The photographs from the hotel, the credit card statements, highlighted and dated. And then, last, I told him about the baby monitor, that I had heard him in our daughter's nursery tell another woman he loved her. I watched every trace of color drain out of his face. He didn't try to deny the photographs. He couldn't. They were too clear, too damning. But what he said next is something I don't think I'll ever fully process. He didn't apologize first. He asked, voice shaking, "How long have you known?" Not, "I'm so sorry." Not, "Let me explain." His first instinct, faced with undeniable proof of a months-long affair, was to figure out how much damage control he still had time to do, how much I'd already pieced together, how cornered he actually was. That question told me more about who he'd become over the past year than almost anything else in this entire story. I told him everything: the key card, the hotel charges, Danielle's name, the fact that I'd known for over 2 weeks and had spent that entire time building an unshakable case instead of confronting him with nothing but suspicion. I watched him process, in real time, that he hadn't been in control of this conversation for weeks, that I'd simply let him believe he was. He started talking then, the way people in his position always seem to, about feeling lost after Sophie was born, about feeling like I'd stopped seeing him as anything but a co-parent, about Daniel making him feel exciting again in a way he swore he never meant to act on until somehow he did repeatedly for months. I let him talk. I wanted to hear the full shape of the story he'd built to justify what he'd done. And when he finally finished, I asked him the one question I most needed an answer to. Did you ever think about what would happen if I found out through her from someone else instead of from you? Or were you planning on doing this forever? He didn't answer. He just put his head in his hands, and for a long moment, the only sound in our kitchen was the quiet hum of the baby monitor on the counter, Sophie still peacefully asleep in the next room, completely unaware that her parents' marriage had just permanently changed. Part 10. The moment. Everything shifted again. I told Ryan I needed space, that I couldn't make any decisions about our marriage in that moment, that I needed him to leave for a few days while I figured out what came next. He agreed, packed a bag with shaking hands, and left for his brother's house that same afternoon. I spent that first night alone with Sophie in a strange, hollowed-out quiet, replaying every detail of the past several months, trying to understand how I'd missed so much for so long, even though I knew rationally that the entire architecture of an affair is built specifically to be missed. 2 days later, while I was going through our shared email account to sort out some logistics, insurance, a bill I needed to check, I found something I hadn't been looking for and wasn't prepared for at all. An email sent to Ryan's personal account from an address I didn't recognize, with a subject line that made my hands go cold. We need to talk about the baby. I sat frozen at my desk, staring at that subject line for a long time before I let myself open it. What I read inside that email changed everything I thought I understood about this entire situation. Not just about Ryan and Danielle, but about a timeline, a set of dates, and a piece of information so much bigger than anything I'd uncovered so far that I had to read it 3 times before the full weight of it actually landed. I'm going to stop the story right here because what that email revealed deserves its own telling. And because I promise you, what I found out in the days after reading it is more shocking than everything I've told you so far combined. Part 11. To be continued. I know how it feels to be left hanging like this, and I promise I'm not doing it to be cruel. I'm doing it because this story genuinely has another layer that I want to tell properly. With the same care I've told you everything up to this point. What do you think was in that email? Do you think it was about Danielle or someone else entirely? Let me know your theories in the comments below because some of you have guessed things in my other stories that were honestly closer to the truth than I expected. If you want to hear what happened next, what that email really said, how I confronted Ryan a second time, and how this story actually ended, make sure you're subscribed because part 2 is coming very soon, and trust me, you do not want to miss it. Thank you so much for listening to my story. Take care of yourselves, trust your instincts, and I'll see you very soon for part 2.